So yeah, in 2014, I curated a show in East Village at Space for Art, an independent artist run space that also is artist in residence space, where many artists were living and practicing at the time, and obviously a very different space from the downtown San Diego's art gallery up on the 9th floor here, but in a lot of ways similar as well, in the same area of the city, roughly, and very close to one another, and also both public spaces where, as public exhibitions, exhibitions aren't always, even public exhibitions, available and accessible to the general public, but these are spaces in which there already is a lot of traffic, either by the artist community or people that were living on the street around, in the encampments at that time that have been pushed out with gentrification, at that time around Space for Art, in East Village. And so it was very meaningful when Bonnie reached out to me in 2019 and asked me to curate a part 2 of Occupy Thirdspace. The premise of the show, the title Occupy Thirdspace, is all about occupying a largely academic imaginary that was sort of invented in the spaces of the Ivory Tower, the spaces of the institution, of the academic institution. Not to say that the idea of third space doesn't apply to the border, to talking about the border, but the way that the idea of third space was being applied to talk about the border in the spaces of academia, to me, seemed to be a little reductive and overly taking too many liberties in terms of claiming what art does. I'm going to try to keep my language, kind of clear and simple here. So if we're asking, like, what does art do to or on the border, right? That we don't know. There's no, definitive answer to that. There's no like multiple choice answer to that question. But what I did know was that art doesn't erase the border. It doesn't, make it a moot point. Our theories and our artwork, and we can't just say, well, we're going to theorize the border sort of out of existence by talking about it as a man-made, human-made imaginary space or line that actually connects a very interconnected, interdependent region. My experience of the border has never been, interdependent in the ways that I've heard it described before, right? Actually, I was looking at it more from that point of the persistence of the duality and of the difficulty that persists of trying to navigate this border. And so how disrespectful it was to say that theory or art can just come, or any other thing, that just kind of some spontaneous thing can happen and erase, or delete the border, or that we can render it render it out of existence in our imaginations, and therefore we can talk about it as not existing anymore, or as a third country or a third space, or an interdependent region. It is a very interdependent region, but by a very strict hegemonic order in which the ruling class is determining, the hegemon, which is the United States, but mainly corporations, right, that are dictating the economy that even artists have to participate in, right, in order to survive. So I wanted to say, let's occupy this third space and let's really kind of detonate it, and then let's look at the pieces, and let's do that by looking at artists' individual and collective practices and how they've actually gotten on the ground and engaged with the community, availed themselves of the other side, whatever side they may be from, or artists particularly that have come to the borderlands to study art or to emerge as an artist, to really pay attention to the region if we're going to claim that it's a region, in a holistic manner. To not come to San Diego to study art or anything else for that matter, and not ever avail yourself of the other side, of Tijuana in particular here. At least enough to get some kind of a basic education, right? And so that was my kind of my interest, my soapbox, and what I was screaming when I started graduate education in arts at UCSD in 2012, 13. And gosh, it's been a decade already, and I'm still a PhD candidate. Yay! But I wanted to work with MFAs when, PhDs and MFAs were working together. Art historians, curators, and practicing artists were working together and collaborating. I didn't want to just keep it in like the safe little enclave of UCSD that gets to ride the coattails of its transborder art legacy or of its border art legacy. I wanted to keep it kind of, and all other institutions, kind of accountable and honest to that goal of actually engaging in double learnings across the border. So I looked at the work of those around me, of my peers who already were really availing themselves of the other side. I wasn't going to like take, hey, who wants to go on a tour and then like go, teach people about Tijuana and how cool it is. And then they might get inspired to make an artwork, right? So that wasn't like the model that I was, after in terms of trying to encourage this double learning. It was more like seeking out others who had some of the same interests that I did, and who didn't allow their language barrier or the fear of the other side, or they're just, feeling awkward or uncomfortable crossing, or not wanting to ever break their like cool artist, persona or whatever, that didn't allow that to get in the way. They crossed, they spent time on the other side. We collaborated. We tried to find ways to get money in cash form to be able to actually support communities, wherever there was funding, to be able to use funding in a way that was going to actually be transformative or helpful, or right. And so with that, I wanted to, maybe the presentation isn't gonna work. Okay. So I had images of Occupy Thirdspace Part 1, but I will share all of these with you all online and on the website of the exhibition. But for now, let's just focus on the conversation, the reason why we're all here today. And we can, in that process, I think, reflect on some of the artworks and the processes of planning and installation and whatnot for Occupy Thirdspace Part 1 and 2. Just to give a little bit of a premise of, or to give an explanation of the premise of Occupy Thirdspace Part 2, this exhibition that's installed now here in the gallery, in the library gallery. When Bonnie invited me in 2019, ended up, because of COVID, getting postponed until February of this year. I wanted the show to have some kind of a logic of a sequel, right? Some kind of a justification, not just, an arbitrary sequel. So I thought about what can we do to continue this conversation in a way that is meaningful and that is relevant and that is reflected in, that is inspired by the work of the artists and their trajectories and its embeddedness within the borderlands, and not the other way around. And so I thought about these past 8 years, reflecting on following these artists' trajectories and what I'd researched and written, and others whom I had heard speak, others whom I'd read. And to me, this idea of palabra really just keeps coming up, right? And I think palabra, though translated directly as, word into English, doesn't really have a direct translation or a simple translation. Just as word also doesn't have, the word doesn't have a simple kind of definition or translation. For example, you can think of oral traditions, right, or oral histories, to spoken word, to languaging, which is a kind of parallel operation to language, deconstructing language, playing with language until it's no longer language, although it might kind of disguise itself as such. And this as a tradition has a particularly strong legacy in Mexican art. And when we're talking about Tijuana, many people say, well, Tijuana's not Mexico. But Tijuana is Mexico. And there's a lot in the art history of Tijuana that is very much Mexican art history and Mexican revolutionary history and, the political history. So I think, again, not to emphasize the duality and to say like, yes, this border is, we're not interconnected and we're just so different and parallel. But I definitely I wanted to highlight in this exhibition that, look, there is a strong Mexican influence in U.S. art history, in North American art history, that we need to look at. And Palabra is one of the bases on which, I think that this influence can be really clearly traced. And so we can look, since I study performance art, from early Mexican film to how that became early experiments in performance before there was such a thing called performance art, for example, invented in the US, right, in Europe, and right, but and so across media, though, we can also see the importance of this influence of Palabra as it's played out and in so many different ways in these particular artists' work. So it's really fascinating to me to look at that, and it's radical to me to explore how there are so many ways that language, the ultimate tool of oppression, the ultimate tool of coloniality, has been inverted and continues to be. There's like infinite number of ways in which, word, written word, spoken word, right? There's so many different forms that it can take. And I think there's like no end to that affirmative sabotage or defacement of language. So that's what I was really interested in exploring, and the artworks that I chose, the artists that I chose. It was an ongoing conversation with these artists to arrive at the works that we would exhibit. But in general, they're all artists that have this as a, very embedded in their practice, as a very solid kind of aspect or element of their practice, ongoing. And so I brought some questions, some open-ended questions for discussion that I'm going to just pose to our panel and see who is interested in answering which question. These aren't, I haven't asked them to prepare anything today because I really wanted the conversation to be very organic and for all of you to be able to join in whenever you'd like to interrupt. And with a small group like this, that's the kind of benefit also, that we can have a really cool, intimate conversation. So the artists that are here with us today in person on our panel, are the other artists still, the virtual artists are still hearing me, right? Okay. Okay. So I'll just start from here and introduce you going down the line, though I don't have images of your artworks. I'm sorry, artists. This is Omar Pimienta, Alida Cervantes, Amy Sanchez, and Misael Diaz of Cognate Collective, and Grant Looning and Pepe Rojo of Comité Magonista, Tierra y Libertad. So thank you all. Let's give our artists a round of applause. Okay, so maybe I should go down there and join you now. Okay. Check. Can you hear me? Is it amplifying? Okay. Maybe I do know how to work the mic. Am I working the mic, Francisco? Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So I had these questions and I just wrote them. I wrote them in my little book here. And I wanted to ask you all.
We feel like we're on a test, right?
Do you feel does this feel?
Like a test. I feel
I'm used to other people making me nervous, not making others nervous. And sometimes you don't realize that you're making others nervous while they're making you nervous. Okay. Um, okay, so that's better, huh? Yeah. Speak a little bit more into it. Working the mic. Okay. So thinking about reflecting on your own trajectory as an artist in the borderlands, living and working in the borderlands, and particularly here in Tijuana, San Diego, what's a memory or a moment you can recall that really speaks to your decision to stay or to be or to work here and not somewhere else? As I'm sure many of you have had opportunities to do that, and many artists have chosen to do that, to leave this region in a lot of ways. What's who you are? Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot to introduce our artists that are here virtually as well. Let me interrupt myself for a second. So here on the screen behind me, I apologize, Luis and Adriana. We have Luis Hock, and Luis Hock collaborated with Elizabeth Sisco and David Avalos. And also they each had their individual practices. And so really their work is a historical anchor point for this show with the Art Rebate Project. I hope you all get a chance to check out the exhibition as well after the talk. So Luis, thank you so much for being here. And Adriana Trujillo as well, who is joining us virtually from the from Union Srpska. And so Adriana is a filmmaker, but for this exhibition, she actually did an installation which involves, experimental video, but also with an installation component. So I hope you'll be able to check out all the artworks. So let's give a round of applause also for Adriana and Luis. Thank you for being here virtually. Sorry, I looked back there and I saw you and I thought, I forgot. Okay, so again, posing the question to everyone, repeating the question. So thinking about why you chose to stay here and what site specificity means to you in your work, and maybe reflecting and answering that question about the difference in the experiences you had when you've shown work or made work outside of this region, and when you've made and shown work in this region, like the difference in that experience or that feeling of doing that, and why stay here. Or was it even ever a question? Was it ever even a choice? Or was it like just this was always what I was going to do, right? So I'd like to start there. Alida, Alida, Alida Cervantes.
Hello. I've been voted to have to answer. Well, in my case, I actually did go away. I studied in Italy for 2 years. That's where I studied painting. And then I came back and got my undergraduate degree from UCSD. And then I went back to Italy because I wanted to paint. And the school of where I was studying over there actually was doing a lot of, it was a painting school. And then after I got bored of that, I actually went to New York City for 4 years because I decided I'm an artist. I'm going to go to New York City. I didn't show one time in New York. I mean, I was just surviving. And ultimately, the reason that I came back here is, I mean, it's a personal reason. It wasn't a professional reason. I wanted to be with my people, really I did. In New York City, it was really hard to feel like a sense of community. And I mean, I guess for me that I was a outsider. And so I came back to Tijuana and then moved to San Diego, got my graduate degree. And I never really, I mean, I've thought about it like, okay, I could, if I moved to LA, maybe more things would happen, or if I moved to Mexico City. But for me, I'm not willing to sacrifice like that much for my career. For me, it's very important, my personal connections with my family, my friends, people that I know forever. And to be honest, I love Tijuana. I love Tijuana. I can say I also really like San Diego, but I mean, I love Tijuana. I love working where I work, and I have a studio in downtown Tijuana, which inspires me and makes me feel like I want to paint every day. And that's, I don't feel I need to go anywhere else, and that's why I'm here.
Cool. Thank you.
Should we just
Yeah, anyone who would like to answer, yeah.
okay? I'll go next because Alida said so.
Not everyone has to answer all the questions, right?
Yeah. So hi everybody. Again, my name is Amy Sanchez Arteaga, and I'm part of Cognate Collective. So I work with Misael Diaz, who's here to my side. And I think for us, and for maybe I can speak. Do you want me to speak collectively? I think that when we think about our region and when we think about the border, we really have thought quite regionally. So I was born in the Imperial Valley, which is east of here, and then we met when we were undergraduates in Los Angeles, and we started like learning about these conceptions of the border that were articulated, we felt sort of at a distance or were at odds with a lot of the lived experience of what it meant to be a kind of quotidian fronterizo, right, border crosser, and that experience. And I think that was part of what initially sparked this interest in returning home so I should say that I grew up in the Imperial Valley, but I had my uncle, so my mom's brothers, I went to UCSD. And so when I was a little kid, I got to spend a lot of time in this city. And so I guess similar to what Alida mentions, I think having a sense of rootedness and kind of relationship and the fact that our family was near and served also because we didn't have a lot of money in the inception of a lot of our projects. So like my mom letting us borrow her like SUV to move things, or like Misael's parents helping us like store and transport things at their house in Tijuana, or these. I think it was a really kind of natural support system that enabled us to build our practice and to build it from a point of specificity and sort of theorizing, the self-theorizing, this legacy of also experiences of migration within this region that our family had as as people who are from the border. So do you want to say? No?
Sorry, I wanted to add something really quick, which is actually really important. Because growing up in Tijuana, my father's from Mexico City, and I always had the notion that there was no culture in Tijuana. That culture was, down south in Mexico City and Oaxaca and all these places with a rich history, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think for me, on a certain level, there's a kind of, I think I'm trying to be like, well, no, I'm going to make culture be here. I'm going to make, I don't want artists, maybe right now I have a solo show in Tijuana. Some people were like, well, why are you doing a solo show at this place in Tijuana? Who's going to see it? And I said, well, people from Tijuana are going to see it. And they're going to see that there's a painter, and maybe they don't have to go somewhere else to be, I want Tijuana to be a rich city. And I think that staying there is
Contributing.
Yeah, I want to contribute. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. We always end up sitting next to each other during roundtables, and I always like that.
And then
Okay. I love Tijuana, as Alida says. It's a kind of like I arrived in Tijuana, I don't know, a long time ago in 2006 from Mexico City. And before that, I was born and lived in Guerrero in the south. So I kind of like across the country to be here. And it blew my mind in very particular ways. It's kind of like I remember being on a hill in Tijuana, knowing that in Tijuana it was 4 p.m., while on the other side of the border on the hill it was 6 p.m. And it was kind of like, oh my God, the construction of reality is kind of like so crystal clear here and so easy to see and so easy to also to kind of like play with it. Because it's kind of like, I don't know, whenever I cross the border, and I crossed the border a while ago, it's kind of like a interdimensional travel. During a kind of like reality with certain rules, and suddenly you pass this ritual portal, and suddenly you're in a different reality. So that allows people with my kind of inclinations to think a lot about what's going on and how's it going on. That's one. Two, working on the street, which is something I really enjoy doing. Whenever I did it in Mexico City, it was really impersonal. It was more kind of like a show here, but whenever I do it here, I think it's people are much more closer. There's kind of like a different interaction, which I really appreciate and love. It's with everybody on the panel, virtual and real. We've collaborated. And we've collaborated several times, and it's not been kind of like a hassle. It's like, oh, do you want to collaborate with me? It's, hey, we're doing this. Why don't you come back? And it's been kind of like really informal. So that's also kind of like a really appealing to me, even with Grant and Tierra y Libertad, which we've been doing for 6 years. It's kind of like, oh, well, let's get this thing going. And I don't know, I kind of like the way things roll here. And the English and Spanish thing, the way it's a corner, where I don't know, it's kind of like a slogan, the most crossover border in the world, but it's also the only place where the former third world and the former first world rub shoulders against each other. So the contrasts here are kind of illuminating in very, very particular ways, and things happen here with a kind of like I'm not sure the word is right, but with a magical lucidity that allows you to see the world through very particular lenses that for me are quite illuminating. So so yeah, it's just kind of different, and it's I mean, I like Tijuana because it's a very exciting city. It's like there's always something to watch, there's always something to see, there's always something to kind of like turn your head around. I don't know, this thing about border art, I think a lot about it. It's if it's something that defines us, it's kind of funny because it defines us in a negative way. It's kind of like, oh no, we don't like the border, but it also defines us. So even that paradox is kind of like a really interesting to work inside of it, and to live inside of it, and to kind of like suffer it, because it's not easy. You see things in the border that are constantly break your heart. It's a very cruel region in that sense, but kind of like having that openness for your heart being broken once in a while, I think it's important in the work we can do here, and also making that heartbrokenness cross the border both ways it's really important. Just one more thing, okay? There's a thing I would like to highlight. It's January 2017. Right after the election of Donald Trump, right at the end of Peña Nieto's regime, the same week, there was a manifestation here in San Diego, the biggest ever, and there was a manifestation in Tijuana, the biggest ever. Okay, people in Tijuana were saying, "You are not my president," okay, pointing towards Mexico City. People in San Diego were saying, "You are not my president," pointing towards Washington. And it's like, oh my God, these groups of people are saying exactly the same thing while giving their backs to each other. They're not even thinking about, oh, hey, you're saying the same thing I am, but in a different language. Kind of like, for me, it was kind of like amazing. Like, how is this happening? And these people are not turning back and saying, hey, you're saying the same thing as I am. Why don't we talk? Instead of shouting like kind of like 2,000 miles away. Okay, so that bridge is important for me.
Thank you, Pepe. Omar? Next one. Grant? Yeah, I would love to invite Luis and Adriana to answer. I mean, I know as of very recently, Adriana, you are no longer living here in the Tijuana San Diego border region. But interestingly, you found another border region and also, right, are one of the people that for a long time continually worked here in this region, and not only worked here, but brought a lot of others for longer term projects that were more continuous and that include exchanges, and included a lot of, you know, inspirational work inspired by the work of the youth too, and how Tijuana enters into that conversation internationally through
Yeah. Okay. How's the audio? It's okay?
Yeah, we can hear you okay.
Okay, I can hear some, but okay, thank you, Sarah, for the presentation, Bonnie, and all my friends there, all amigos. It's nice to see you virtually, but trying to answer the question. Interesting to hear all of you talking about the city I born, you know, like I born in Tijuana, I grew up there, and for me, this is only the second time I created a piece for this exhibition that is out of the city of my city, and the other one was a short film in Barcelona. I was studying the master's, so for academic reasons I was out of the city. All of my work, like including programming and cultural promotion, as you mentioned, with your communities, with Joan artists, with cultural events, and everything is being developed in the city. For this occasion, I moved to my residence years ago, but through the pandemic, I returned to Tijuana, and I started to develop also this relationship with other borders. So I'm in the border now with the European Union, again, another border, another context, but also I become also an immigrant here. So I experience my city by distance, but also by the eyes of someone which is desplazado, which is moving from the territory of the corner they create. So that made me a completely different perspective with my city, but also of myself. And talking about the piece I proposed, I've been discussing a lot during these 2 years, and I've been super honest with her about what I want to present. I want to introduce something that definitely relates to this concept of palabra, or word, and border specifically, because here I don't understand the word of the Serbian. I'm studying Serbian, but it's super complicated language for me. So I also become immigrant, but also another barrier, like the language barrier. And talking about this, the geopolitical situation, another border. So everything makes sense now to propose this anti-agency, new news agency from this region regarding the background of this ex-Yugoslavia territory with Mexico. But I mean, we can talk about that later. But yes, it's the first time I created something not being in Tijuana, but also thinking deeply in that sci-fi, futuristic, no realistic region that I born and I am inspired every day, even when I'm not there anymore.
Thank you, Adriana. Thank you. Beautifully said. And yeah, we can share a little bit about the particular. We'll talk a little bit about the individual pieces as well. But Luis, did you want to answer as well? Is Luis? Are you there, Luis?
I'm here.
Okay. Okay.
Well, I'm here by circumstance. I mean, I spent my early childhood in Nogales, and then I moved to Tucson, and then I'm here, and I've never lived more than about 60 miles away from Mexico. And I've always been an artist that's worked with where I am. And I came here by accident. You know, I mean, I got a job, so I just was back at the border. And my trying to make sense of where I am is what my work is about. And so I've tried to leave here. I mean, lots of times. And I couldn't do it. I mean, I like being here. So, and it's, it represents, in some ways, it's a mirror of my early childhood of living in a place that, you move back and forth across the border. The culture was back and forth across the culture, and relatives. And so it's something that's a context is very familiar to me and comfortable. So that's why I'm making work in this area and continue to.
Thank you, Luis, for that honest answer. I think we do often have like a love-hate relationship with home. But I think especially when home forces you to work so hard, when home is, 1 foot on either side of an international border, that's also, it's like, well, it would just be so much easier if someone gave me an opportunity to just go, stay somewhere else where I was a guest and was just taken care of, because life is hard on the border, especially, depending on how trans-border your identity is, how high your trans-border index is, right? It's splitting yourself between two very different contexts. Okay. So I'm going to move on to the next question now. Let's see. I wanted to think about your own. I'm going to ask this question. What's the relationship between collective memory and your work? Or to what extent is collective memory sort of formative or an important element in your particular practice, or in your emergence as an artist, or coming into a political, or coming into consciousness, right? Coming into political consciousness, or growing, changing, here in this particular site, but just also internally, individually as a person, is collective, the collective memory of particular events, or living through particular historical periods, or a particular cultural context, depending on, if it's on one side or the other, or both. It might have been an important inspirational piece for one of your pieces, an artwork that you did, or ongoing personally as as a person, as an artist. Let's see if anyone's interested in answering that question. And you don't have to answer them if you don't want. Nobody has to answer any of them.
Well, hi, I'm Grant. I'll start because I think our work is revolves strongly, maybe not around collective memory, but around collective forgetting, and the sort of loss of the memory of the 1911 revolution in Tijuana. And I think we started thinking about what it would mean to bring that memory back to Tijuana, to bring it to San Diego. And I've always found that the joy of the introduction, which is facilitated by everyone forgetting about it, is part of the work. And when we were putting up our pieces, it was interesting to have all of the lost moments and the lost parties and the lost flag makings, but remnants in these material forms, in these scraps, in these flags. We couldn't remember who had made some of them, even if we thought that the other person had made them, or we tried to remember where this had been, or where this had been installed, or where we had screwed this one up. And it wasn't there all the time, but the flags were there. And that being one of the lessons to take away from these failed insurrections, these failed political movements, that you don't have to remember them, because you'll leave behind these threads. You'll leave behind these scraps, and they become a kind of generative space where somebody else can make something new. And sometimes something bad, sometimes something less revolutionary. We've talked about Tierra y Libertad and what it means today, and whether that means land and freedom, or whether that means property and freedom from control, or freedom from taxes. You know, like those threads can be taken up because of this forgetting, but it's the opportunity that forgetting offers us that I think we try to embrace.
There's a lot to think about there in what you just said.
Hello everyone. Omar Pimienta here. I guess in my work, it is highly influenced by the idea of collective memory. I guess just because I was born in Tijuana and from a family that migrated to Tijuana, well, that had migrated to the U.S. My father got deported, lived in Tijuana, and then we eventually, the four of us, the kids, were able to obtain documents and go back and forth. So that fluidity forced me to think about the nature of living in like perpetual migration and how different that is than in any other space within the confines that are not borders. So just like visiting family would be traveling, for instance. So I needed to understand migration life and the people around me in my neighborhood in the same context. So everybody was nostalgic from someplace else where their family was coming from or they were coming from, and to a certain point nostalgic of where they were going to go to once they would cross the border, because it was the neighborhood in which I grew up. It was just a neighborhood to go by. Like you'd settle here while someone reaches Los Angeles, Chicago, and then they send money back, and then you're able to cross, and then everybody leaves. So seeing people come and go throughout my life was like a constant questioning, like where is the collective memory of this neighborhood? And that was one of the things that kind of drove my practice. And it was complicated because it was, again, like broken hearts everywhere, right? People that leave, people that come back, people that get deported, people that fail, people that strive, and people that actually succeed. But in this constant pendulum. So I figured, and I'm still trying to figure out a way to create a body of work that can talk about collective memory in a fleeing way, in a migrating way, and to look at space as a more, or I guess as a less solid reality. But then again, the border itself makes it complicated, and it brings me back to the actual reality and the incapacity for this migratory way of life to actually happen. Yeah, I guess that, yeah.
Omar, while you have the mic, would you mind maybe talking a little bit about the colonia in Tijuana and about Colonia Libertad in particular, but maybe talking a little bit about that particular connection between collective memory and the emerging, the ephemeral kind of nature of the history of colonias in Tijuana and other places too. But
yeah, I mean, Colonia Libertad was the first neighborhood to be established in Tijuana. There were 3 neighborhoods at the same time established, and they were established because the workers of the racetrack fought for a piece of land with the racetrack owners. We're talking about 1920s. It actually was founded in 1929. And they came out of a revolt. People occupied the land to take it away from the owner of the racetrack, which was an American citizen. That the owner of the racetrack hired bullies, and there was an actual like shooting between the occupying workers and the people that wanted to take the land back for the racetrack. And the Mexican government, which was pretty much non-existent in the border, had to travel and pretty much settle that down. And they gave the land to the workers, and it was the first neighborhood to be established in a written paper as a neighborhood in Tijuana. And right away, the Great Depression hits, and there's 500,000 Mexican deportees in a couple of years. And that was a matter of just pushing people into the trains, into buses, and bringing them to the border and just pretty much kicking them in. And that's the core of the actual residents of Colonia Libertad, a lot of people that had been kicked out. And it, as a neighborhood, as a Mexican neighborhood, is a really weird mixture of people that had fought for their land and then people that had been kicked out of the neighboring city. So it grew as a neighborhood apart from what eventually became the rest of Tijuana, because Tijuana was pretty much downtown and the party spot, and then a bunch of houses that were pretty much housing people that would come in from downtown, down Mexico, South Mexico. So it had a border, it had a river that divided, one from the US and the other one for the rest of Tijuana, and it was a historically conflicting neighborhood. There's literature, its appearance in constant early literature in Tijuana, the 1950s, 1960s, people writing short stories. It's like a cholo from Colonia Libertad came in, like kicked someone to death. I was talking the other day to the mother of a friend of mine. She was a teacher that came from Mexico to Tijuana in the 40s, and when she was told that she was gonna teach at Colonia Libertad, she cried. Like she knew she was gonna get in trouble. And I'm like, oh, I went to actually that school.
Yeah.
And again, of course, there's mining cities, industrial cities, and then you have Tijuana, which its richness is to supply a demand.
Yeah.
So the people got really good at crossing stuff. So all of I guess the most famous people smugglers would be from Colonia Libertad. They knew the route. Colonia Libertad is right next to the border. They knew the routes. When crossing people became really complicated, well, they would cross drugs. So it's a dense neighborhood, to say the least. But it's also a really rich neighborhood in the sense that when I show the work in, let's say, San Francisco, San Jose, Los Angeles, at least one person would say, oh, my dad crossed through there. Like my grandpa crossed through there. I have an uncle that lived there. A lot of people lived there or spent a little bit of time and have, I guess, good memories as well as bad ones. So that idea of the collective memory of a fleeing space is really interesting, I guess, for me at least, because I've moved now, but it seems that I haven't, because I'm still working with that specific geographic space.
Yeah, you've explored it in as many different ways as you could and continue to, and so many different media and so many different issues, that I think even just like just even in the name Colonia Libertad, you've extracted so much out of that in your work, and now there's a bunch of people running around with free passports and stamps of Colonia Libertad in their passports, because of your work, and the collective memory also grows in different directions. At least a collective memory that maybe is for some people symbolic, only purely symbolic, of Colonia Libertad or secondhand. But it's an interesting layer though. But thank you for educating us on that history. Anyone else would like to answer that question about collective memory? Anyone in the virtual world? Yeah.
Talking about collective memory, I'm searching around for the work that I've done. And I'm thinking none of the work that I've done, as far as I can think about it, is about the collective memory. It's always, and that has to do with the past. There's all obviously elements of anything at the moment, and considering the future has something to do with the past. But the interest is not the collective memory as much as shaping a memory, community, a collective memory, the narrative of the future. It's about doing art to, in fact, take, in some way, influence how the civic narrative is evolving, and insinuating the artist's ideas into the evolving civic narrative. But it's about the future, not really dealing with something that's mnemonic.
Okay. Thank you.
I could also say something. Hi, everyone. My name is Misael Diaz, part of Cogni Collective. I think, interestingly for us, one of the first objects that we became interested in integrating and thinking about, and I think tracing the history of in relation to the border, were plaster piggy banks that are sold at the crossing, sold as just part of kind of curio shops around the city. And I think for us, and are made in Colonia Libertad, as we found out. And Omar has also done work around these objects because they're really interesting. And we became interested in them because of the fact that so many of them were meant to be souvenirs. You know, like they're meant to be these objects that hold memory, right? That are these mnemonic devices that recall a trip to Mexico for the first time, that recall a trip to the city. And yet they seemingly on the face of them have nothing to do with the city, with Mexico. They're part of these kind of invented fantasy, perhaps, of what Mexico is, of what Tijuana is, or they're just reflections of popular culture in the United States, right? One of the few kind of traditional, we can say, versions is actually integrated into the piece, that one of the pieces that we have in the show, and it's just like a plaster piggy bank because they're meant to be filled with currency, right, and then eventually broken. So even that dimension of it was interesting for us. But I think we've also, I think as Luis is sharing, we've become interested in how it is that our work can at once recall how it is that people have experienced the city, have experienced the border, in order to also begin to articulate alternative ways of kind of perhaps scaling up those experiences, because I think so many of the experiences that we've heard from students, for example, about how the practices that their families, you know, used to undertake in order to cross the border, just people's memories of going to visit family, are just rooted in this in these different forms of transgression of the border that I think we became really interested in thinking through, to not just document those as past events, but to also use those in order to envision alternative futures, right? And I think that this is what Luis very beautifully and articulately just put.
Yeah.
And I think what we're really interested in these acts of kind of imagining alternative forms of inhabiting a border, of traversing a border, of, I think, living a border. And I think that, yeah, like in many ways, hopefully, like the work that is being done now will be a memory in the future that is a positive one, and that is, you know, recalling these moments of transformative potential and actualizing of that potential. And I'm thinking of, for example, like Tierra Libertad's work, which does that, I think, very nicely as well, and that it's recalling this past event and inviting us to think about kind of recuperating this act of radical reimagining in the present towards then like impacting and shaping the future. And I think that that's a really powerful, yeah, like a very powerful aspect and dimension of art. And I think that that's just one way I think that it's come to play out in our work.
I think that especially through the pandemic, like something that I found myself asking myself, but I think we found ourselves asking each other too, is like, what kind of ancestors do we want to be, right? Like if like grief is a paradigm that we all inhabited, and I think continue to, and like, I think it's important to make public acknowledgments of like the loss that we've all just lived collectively, like in the last 2 or 3 years. But like if that's a portal and if that's something that we're confronting and we're living, then what are the opportunities for thinking about how we frame and we are living like a lineage that we were living, leaving to others. And I think about Alida's work and I think about Omar's work as both like also, right, like interrogating in a speculative way history in that moment in a really, so I there's like deep ancestral practices, I think, with everybody on the panel. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Go. Yeah.
I really like this idea of going into the future and but also inhabiting the present. And I mean, we all look very serious here, but we have beautiful parties. And whenever I'm with these people, we laugh a lot, even though times are hard. So it's just not just the past and it's the future. It's about our situation inhabiting a border that can make us sad, but can also make us happy. I mean, the first time I worked with Amy and Michelle, I found them on the street. I was doing a project and they were doing a project as well. Wow, let's do something together. I mean, that capacity of the immediacy, of the transience of border life, also kind of like teaches us how to capture those moments of joy, how to live through them, because we don't know where we'll be tomorrow, or on which side of the border. And I think the only way to make memories for the future is to kind of like inhabit the present and have as great a time as one can, when one can.
That reminded me of "And Will Be Again," the title, you know. And I'm just thinking, when I wrote that question, I knew that it would be a really good one because it would be kind of a bit, maybe have the potential to be polarizing in a way, or to be more about the forgetting than the remembering, right? And then also sometimes how artists don't let us forget, right, that easily. So that's another thing that I think art has the capacity to come back in and produce something on the spot there, especially south of the border, without waiting for commission or being invited to do something or funding for doing something, right? Like, Alida's like, oh, this palette looks nice. I think I'll do a defaced colonial figure on this palette, and just let it bleed down. And sometimes like paint well, but also badly on purpose when I want to, and I think like all of that work, especially like the series of the Casta series of Alida's work, in which she explores she uses a lot of the Casta paintings of colonial Mexico, right, of like the Spanish crown in Mexico, which were instrumental in having a kind of visual reference for the ethnographic sort of hierarchy, right, of this caste system, depending on how much African or indigenous heritage one had, right? And the way that Alida, she took a lot of those backgrounds from those Casta paintings and then used them to paint very visceral images, which were hybrid characters with like mojiganga heads or holding a machete, severed body parts, sometimes severed phalluses, right? Like some very visceral imagery there, but which you can't forget after seeing, right? And some of those paintings. Thinking about ERRE's work, who he didn't make it here today. He must have gotten stuck at the border. But think about Marcos Ramirez ERRE's work, especially the Century 21, the front piece that was his sort of debut work as an installation artist for Insight 94, where he placed a Cartolandia house on the plaza of the Centro Cultural de Tijuana, stealing the electricity from the institution and to power up the house, and actually paying off a local official to get like a legit permit to post in the house that, you know, that it had permission to be built, right? And on the same ground where a colonia used to stand, that was kind of conveniently allowed to be washed away by the release of the river, you know, by releasing the river dam at the point that wiped away Cartolandia, cardboard land, one of the biggest post World War II sort of colonias, you know, of people who came to answer the post World War II labor demand, and eventually, you know, was wiped off the map. And for the first installation piece, invited by the official art institution of the city, Centro Cultural de Tijuana, that ERRE chose to do, was to install this and bring back this Cartolandia house on the same ground on which Colonia Libertad or Cartolandia was erased, right? Was washed away. And there's a very painful collective memory, a very painful history of that event too, you know, bodies washing up on the shore. And so bringing back a Cartolandia house to haunt that site of Cartolandia, where now the official art institution of the city faces the United States and turns its back on Mexico, is so telling to so many of those points that were just brought up about, you know, the kind of hostility, or what you were saying also, Pepe, about turning your back on. A lot of times people are turning their backs on, you know, their own people, right? And yeah, supply and demand and the economy, right, also kind of dictates that. That brings me to the next question, actually. I think like that segues really nicely to, well, not nicely, quite cruelly, but I wanted to think also about then the impact of most of the artists here on this panel have begun their practice post NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which went into effect in 1994. And so thinking about the neoliberal economic context, right? And the way that it has, you know, the growth of capitalism and the growth of those different practices that were established under NAFTA on the border, the partial assembly factories, the maquiladoras, and all kinds of other labor, domestic labor, farm work, you know, farm workers labor, thinking about the guest worker programs as well, and all thinking about within this context, practicing in this context as artists. How particularly did you, and I know Amy and Misael, you've done work around this in specific in the Dialogue and Transit project, right? The mobile trans-border conference that we did in Caravan, and just thinking about what has been the impact of that growth of NAFTA, or an aspect of it that is important that your work responds to. What's the relationship between NAFTA and your work? And how has that changed during the pandemic? That's one thing that, you know, like, for example, the pandemic affects your practice a lot, Alida, because you live on one side and work on the other and practice daily, returning back to, you know, to sleep on the other side, and bringing all your dogs with you. And Alida adopts dogs Lida adopts a lot of dogs. And they travel with her back and forth in her pickup with her artwork as well. And I, you know, so thinking about like how NAFTA, and then also particularly in the era of the pandemic now, like affects or impacts your work, or is an important question or issue in your work. Anyone want to answer that question? Yeah, Adriana, Luis.
¿Escuchan?
Yeah. We were just saying, the question was, to talk about the impact of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, on your work, or how much of an important element it is, maybe like in the content of your work. And I think also it would be interesting to hear from you, Luis, on this topic, because your practice really spans, the pre and post NAFTA era. So,
Well, I don't have an answer for your question. I obviously the work we've done has a context, and but I'm not quite so sure that the work we've done has been impacted by NAFTA. I think that the immigration has a really long history, obviously, and I think that active migration back and forth across the border is certainly been changed by NAFTA, and that it's made people more difficult to be fluid entities on the border, and other stuff like capital and goods much more fluid. Nevertheless, I think that the continuing tightness of the border as an effect of NAFTA is probably the most severe or noticeable effect on the work that we've done, because the idea of crossing the border has entirely changed character since when I started doing video work in the 1960s or 1986, 85, 84. You could get caught by the immigration and be back at work the next morning, and it was a relatively inexpensive task if you need to hire a coyote. But now it's a entirely different matter. So I guess NAFTA is not so much the maquiladoras and stuff like that. It's just the character of the border as being a much more difficult barrier for people to cross financially and physically, has changed the terms of the game. I mean, I made a tape in 1986, and then I made a 30-year follow-up, and it was, the nature of the border between those two, it changed drastically, and primarily due to the lack of ease in crossing the border, or possibility in some cases.
yeah. Thank you, Luis. Alida, go ahead.
Ahí está. I would just like to elaborate a little on what Luis is saying, because for me, in my mind, what has made the border as tense is, aside from NAFTA, but in my head, I always think of 9/11. It's like before and after 9/11, because 9/11 is really what actually made the border impossible. Before 9/11, you would cross, the lines weren't so long, and it was a lot easier to get through. And after 9/11, with terrorism, and also the other thing was the drug trade, the cartels that really developed,
The
like
drug
during
war in 2008.
2008,
the drug war.
No, the drug cartels in the 90s, the Arellano cartel, you know, they were like the first big one. I grew up with all that stuff, and you know, that's when the Americans really became like a lot more paranoid. Like, what are they bringing in? So it wasn't just, you know, if it was like an illegal human, now it's drugs, and now it's terrorists, and it really made the border just tremendously tense. I mean, I've been crossing the border since I was like, I think 5 years old, you know, on a
Yeah.
daily basis. So
As an Iranian American, I saw that effect of 9/11. And just crossing any border or going through any airport or doing any, you know, or just being, you know, living while Middle Eastern in the US as well. But yeah, definitely, like I saw with the times I traveled to Mexico City, you know, the federales, like they would tear apart my suitcase. I would go through extra securities, getting like after I went through security, they wanted more security before getting on the plane. They would pull me off of the plane. And so I experienced that as well, and seeing how, you know, Mexico is the gate, the back door, the gate, the kind of like the front to filter people out, make sure, you know, terrorists don't get into the United States.
On those terms, I would also like to add that if someone agrees with kind of like the NAFTA plan are the drug cartels, if someone believes in free trade, if someone believes that the market should rule everything, those are the drug cartels. Because they're not waiting for the border or anything. They're doing their stuff. And the money that can be gained by exchanging certain kind of merchandise is really important. So the idea of the free trade,
Mhm.
I don't know. Whenever I think about free trade, I think about the cartels. I mean, those
Yeah.
guys are all for the market. So I don't think that it's that disconnected. Also in economic terms.
Yeah. I mean, just the versatile use of the word free across these things.
Tierra Libertad
That's
is
always
really
tripped me
problematic.
out. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Did you want to say something too, Amy?
Yeah, I think to mention, because you called out the project Dialogue in Transit and the conference that we did specifically around the 20th anniversary of the North American Free Trade Agreement, and Omar participated in that as well. And in that, we were really thinking about those different scales at which we could think about NAFTA as an experience, as like 20
Mhm.
years of this event, as this like legislative event. And so I guess something that I just wanted to say is that my big takeaway, what I really learned that day, was about the ways that that legislation had really functioned to borderize, right, Mexico as a nation, and also to think about how that fact, or like that fact of that kind of borderization of a country, then leads to a really specific kind of phenomenology around work, around like what is the experience of our neighborhood, of our body. I remember that day talking with Fred Lonadier, who was one of the people who had come along, and talking about like exhaustion as a condition of like capitalism, and because so many people were talking about being tired, and so like the way that that was just significant of a kind of temporality that corresponds to a really specific kind of production, and so I suppose that I don't know, maybe I don't know if you would agree or not, but thinking about, right, like the temporality and like the sightedness and the way that something plays out in the body and in the specificity of a site. I think to also talk about this question sort of site specificity, I think that it's been a useful metaphor or lens, I guess, for thinking about that.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that, to kind of emphasize the point around the ways in which NAFTA borderizes a larger territory, is that many of the kind of free trade policies that NAFTA made national at the scale of Mexico already existed at the border and have always kind of existed, you know, since 1965 with the border industrialization program. So the presence of multinational factories has always been a condition. Of course, the scale of those really explodes with NAFTA, but I think that also, for me, it creates this interesting dynamic where Tijuana and the border also becomes kind of a site from the future, right? In the sense that there's also a lot of the dynamics and conditions around violence, around the commodification of bodies, around the disposability of certain bodies that I think we perhaps now understand as linked to NAFTA have kind of existed prior to that moment. And there's a way in which those have already been dynamics that we've had to contend with along the border. So there's a kind of sad experience with that, and I think that yeah, it opens up the possibility, I think, to also imagine how it is that the methodologies for research, for creative production that I think emerge from this context are then applicable, right, to other contexts that are also now feeling the impacts of the kind of economic policies, political policies around border militarization, around border enforcement, around, you know, the immigration enforcement tactics that are privatized. Like all of these dynamics that I think are part of our territory are becoming increasingly relevant to other contexts that we might not initially think of as border contexts, right? So I'm thinking of, for example, how during this previous administration, there was seizing upon the fact that tactics around policing and surveillance that are designed for the border can be implemented really within any border context in the United States, including borders with like natural features. So like the 100-mile terrain of the border that we see, which is why you have like border checkpoints, you know, in San Clemente, for example. Essentially border patrol and these kinds of policies you're able to enact within 100 miles of an actual international border. But you could also think about the border as being the border with the ocean, right? So like really all of the coastal territory of the United States is privy to this kinds of policing tactics that you see at the border, right? So I think when you think about that, then there's like, I think I might be mistaken, so double check the stat, but I think it's a large quantity, maybe more than half of the United States population that lives in a border territory when you think about the border in those contexts, right? So I think that because, you know, cities along the coast tend to be very heavily populated, whereas the center of the country slightly less so. So I think that, yeah, thinking about NAFTA as a moment is interesting because I think it just made widespread a lot of the conditions and dynamics that I think we had been living here to some extent or another, and made them more common. More people like were impacted by those policies. So I think it made more relevant, I guess, for me, the types of interests and questions that I think artists at the border have been posing for a very long time.
Thank you, Omar. And then after this one, we'll open it up for.
Yeah, I just want to add that NAFTA comes with Operation Gatekeeper, and it comes with a bunch of money to detour people to the desert. So it's just like Machiavellic, like, okay, let's bring everything that all material goods are free to come and go, but we don't want the people. We'll just push them to the desert because, as you mentioned, maquiladoras have been in the border region since El PRONAF, since another program that facilitated that business across the border. But the highly criminalizing of migrants and the death count are synchronous with NAFTA. On the Tijuana side, I do have to add is that we went crazy. Like maquiladora, like maquila art, like Otis, Zacarias had a place that was La Maquila, which was his studio. There were like 5 like huge shows about people working with residuals of maquila. And it's weird because there's so many different levels. Like Alida and I, yes, of course, 9/11 was horrible because all of a sudden I was going to Southwestern College, and all of a sudden I had to do like a 3-hour line when it used to be like half an hour. So I would have to wake up at like 3 or 4 to get to my 8 o'clock class. But that's not comparable with just like cross the desert. So it was really horrible for people that would flow through the border with ease because of that. But it was just like mind blowing for people that just wanted to come to Tijuana and pursue the American dream. That was no longer the case. Like the prices of a coyote had skyrocketed, so now I would have to risk my life. That's kind of the, so it does coincide with just that.
Just on that note, it's kind of funny because there's kind of like this huge abstraction that has gone on through the last 100 years. I mean, we work with Tierra, Libertad, Land and Freedom, Earth and Liberation, and suddenly that turned into a job and a house. And suddenly right now it's real estate and investments. There's kind of like an ongoing abstraction while the going on the bodies gets tougher and tougher and tougher. I mean, the Operation Gatekeeper is outsourcing murder to the sun.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it is. So this, at the same time, there's this kind of like weird abstraction, and the bodies and the material goods are kind of like constricted to more and more rules and regulations, and I don't know.
Thank you. I'd like to maybe pause or interrupt our ongoing conversation to see if anyone in the audience has questions that they'd like to ask. Yeah, there's a mic there in the back so that you can be heard.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello, friend.
Hi.
What is your name?
My name's Elijah Sol. I'm
Elijah.
actually Norel Martinez's son. I know you guys are friends with her.
Nice to
Hi,
meet
Lida.
you.
So Alida actually brought something up that has actually been on my mind for a while. And I wanted to ask a question about it. Yeah, you did. You mentioned the narcos, right? And the idea of narcotraficantes and narco gangs and organized gang violence. Well, basically, narcos specifically, they're their own specific thing unique to Mexico. And two, I've been researching the narco corrido specifically, y movimiento alterado, which stands for altered movement. It's not alternative, it's altered movement, right? And I highly suggest that you look up Movimiento Alterado and to read the lyrics both in English and in Spanish and really like digest them and dissect them and put them apart, put them back together, rearrange them, whatever you want to do with them. But pay attention to them. But I met a couple days ago with a former UCSD professor. I'm not going to name him, but I was talking to him about the influence of music. And the way that it has an influence on, like the way that lyrics have influences on people's like consciousness, right? And he was like, oh yeah, like neo-Nazi metal has racist propaganda, or it has a racist skew, you know? And so that he understood that was problematic to people of color, right? Music like that. And so I posed to him, well, what about the narco corrido, you know? Well, what do you think about that? And he was like, well, he basically said that he didn't have an opinion on it, or he thought that the idea of the narco corrido or the idea of the narco is a justifiable. It was born from Mexico, he said. So to him it was like that cultura, he called it the narco cultura. He said is has just of a much right, basically, to live in Mexico and be part of Mexico and be part of the Mexican identity and be part of the Mexican culture, to which me and my friend that had gone to talk to him politely disagreed, and we had this heated debate, and we ended up not seeing eye to eye. He left kind of upset. We were okay. But anyway, I guess the question that I pose to you is, as artists living in a digital age in which media is able to transcend borders, media is able to go to the other side of the world, and you can look up whatever you want right now. What do you feel about narcocultura and narco corridos as media producers and art producers that are, you know, by my former professor's standards, are pretty much as justified artists? You know, like he considers the narco corrido also a justified form of art, and it's pretty clear to me that the art that you guys produce and the things that you talk about are very different compared to Movimiento Alterado. So I just wanted to hear what your opinions on that was. Yeah.
So basically, you want to know if I think or if I feel that the narco corridos are basically like a good or a bad thing. Mhm. Uh-huh. Yeah. Mhm. Yes. Uh-huh.
Music that isn't as problematic, you
Mhm.
know. So my question to you is also as someone that produces art, what would you say to like what would you say to your narco corrido cousin per se?
Mhm.
You know what I mean?
Okay, well, first I want to say, yeah. Well, first I want to say, I think there's a generational thing where maybe people of my generation are used to maybe, taking more shit, from everywhere. Me, for example, as a Mexican woman, I'm used to sexual harassment in Mexico, even if you don't like it. And I think that the younger generations are sort of becoming more sensitive to the effects of a lot of things, and therefore trying to, from gender issues, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, a lot of different issues. I think your generation is putting a lot more limits and questioning things on a deeper level. And so for me, that I'm a very different generation, I grew up literally surrounded by the cartel people. Um, and and when I was in my teenage years, I mean, I didn't know whether the Arianos were going to show up at a party and shoot somebody or beat somebody up, or I mean, I had close friends that were shot, killed, beheaded, etc., etc. And during that time, I mean, I remember at a certain point, I was like, I need to learn. If I'm from Tijuana, I need to learn a narco corrido. So I did. I learned my narco corrido, and I can sing it to you right now. But but dicen que venían del sur en un carro colorado. Bueno, etcétera, etcétera. But anyway, I agree with you that certain music has bad effects. For example, hip hop can be very misogynistic and very violent. Music that I like, my personal favorite music is from Cuba. It's called timba music, and it's extremely misogynistic. And to be honest, I listen to it anyway, and I love it. Maybe if I was of your generation, I would be less tolerant, because I'd be like, what the fuck? Well, I mean, what the hell? Sorry. Um, so I actually agree with you. I agree with you that certain things might cause, bad effects. But at the same time, I don't feel like I'm going to go, lecture Los Tucanes de Tijuana or, Los Tigres del Norte on like what you should be composing or not composing, because sometimes if that's your surrounding and that's your reality, that's what you're going to speak to. You know what I mean? Maybe, and some of them, maybe they're doing it to be cool, and yes, machismo. But I mean, I think that art is like playing, and I think that art is like dreams. You can't say like, I had a bad dream. Oh my God, why did I have that dream? There's good and there's bad, and I think that art can show the good and the bad, and but I understand very much how it can be problematic. That's my official opinion.
It's yeah. I happen to have my brother Juan Carlo Ramirez, who is an actual narco corrido scholar. he found like the oldest narco corrido in history. And one of the funny things about that corrido alterado thing is it comes right after Mexico bans in radio stations, radio waves, narco corrido. So narco corrido gets banned in Mexico. No one can listen it on the radio waves, but of course everybody jumps into YouTube or downloads the music anyways. And what happens is that this corrido alterado, which is like narco corrido on steroids, it comes up from a binational process. It's people writing the lyrics in Los Angeles, recording on the American side, and influencing whoever listens to it. Now, we would have to determine what is culture and what is a cultural product. If your cultural product, a video, a poem, a novel, a song, finds a community and that community holds it up, then it is culture. And if you have a song that's talking about pulling up a bazooka in the middle of a city in Mexico and decapitating people, and it has thousands of likes, you can't deny that's a cultural product. So I agree with your professor in that sense, but I also agree with you and Alida that it's pretty messed up. But is censoring like the way to go? I think Mexico proved that it's not, because it only forced people to go even more hardcore. And historically, yes, the corrido is it's only, I'm quoting my brother here, is Mexico is the only country in the world that still produces baladas, which is the corridos. Like that genre like died everywhere else. And he pretty much argues that it is because violence has not gone away since the early days, previous of Mexican Revolution, and from like the origin of corridos, violence, oppression, the people trying to write the story of people that will not be heard. And that, but it's just a replica of the reality of the nation in itself. So, yeah.
I wanted to sort of take a meta perspective on this, because to me this gets at the very theme of the show, Palabra and Plástica, of language and material, let's put it that way. Our project came out of a shared writer's irritation with people thinking of words as simple conveyors of meaning, and thinking about the strangeness of a word and the strangeness of what a word fails to convey, or the things that the word does that escapes it, and how exciting that is when you put it into material. So the examples you give of the neo-Nazis or the corridos, I think there's an important factor that always needs to be there, which is language is not something that influences our brains. Language is something that happens in places between people. And when that language brings certain people together, then the consequences can be really toxic or violent. But, Omar's words written in concrete on the pictures, or the weight of the Tierra y Libertads I've had to carry around for 6 years, the material quality of it, that is, I think, underappreciated and missed. So the question of whether it's art or whether it should be censored, I think is, I don't know enough to answer that, but I do know that we pay too much attention to mere meaning and not to what the words do when they're actually passed around. What is the object? Is it the YouTube clip that's passed around that makes a connection between two people? Is it the fabric that has to be carted back and forth across the border? The meaning of Tierra y Libertad that Pepe brought up is constantly decomposing or abstracting. That's something that hopefully our fabric, our paint, has a different trajectory that it introduces. Whether somebody agrees with the meaning of the words or not, or whether the words hit somebody's heart or influence their brain, I'm less concerned with whether or not they can pick up a flag and have their whole body reoriented by this piece of fabric that's flying around. And maybe the meaning gets to them and maybe it doesn't, but the movement matters to me, or the concrete word matters to me.
We think of this and also kind of like not knowing what art or culture is. I know people think that art and culture are good by default, but I know from experience that there are cultures you have to escape from, that they're so toxic and so that it's cultures and the whole cultures that people have to escape from. So I don't know, and I'm riffing here. Okay, there was this discussion about the border wall being a work of art when Trump came into a presidency, which was kind of like, okay, but if the border wall is a wall of art, is a work of art, then so is 9/11. Okay, which is kind of like, oh, there we get into very problematic territory. I don't know if it's a work of art or not, but I do know it has an aesthetic effect. And here we're talking about aesthetics, and the border has an aesthetic effect because it affects our bodies and the way our bodies live in this area. And that aesthetic effect for me, as Grant was saying, is much more interesting than any other thing. What it does to our bodies, in the same way that narco corridos have that effect, and that you can dance to them. Yeah, it's kind of like there's a joy, and you can't. It's not like something that's it comes out, and you have to deal with it, whether you like it or not. And I kind of like learn from it also, even if you disagree, as I disagree with border.
Yeah, that was.
Can I just add one thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
So it's interesting because this makes me think of this question of, like on a zoomed out way, like the effect that words have, right? Thinking back to the show. And I think about the piece that we made, in effect, reflecting on how the border has been legislated from afar, usually, right? Like the border has been legislated as an imaginary, and it's actually discourse that is shaping what the border is without regard for the actual dynamics on the ground, right, that you experience. And I think a really powerful example of this that we like to bring up is that when we started working, the San Isidro port of entry was being redeveloped, like was being renovated, not just so they could catch more criminals or catch more drugs, but also to increase the flow of cars being able to move, or at least on the surface, that was the rationale, right? Because there's an understanding on the ground here in San Diego, Tijuana, that there's tens of thousands of people that are crossing every day. And that's a necessity. Like, that's just, it's not like a question of like, should we or should we not? It's like, no, that needs to happen because of how interconnected the communities are. And yet at the national level, you have this discourse around like building a wall or like preventing these flows of migration, right? And these flows of movement. And so that disconnect, I think, between words and legislation and how that is being legislated from afar and the impact that that has on communities is something that we've been really interested in. And really, I think the opportunity that allows to really play with language and to think about how it is that we can reimagine also just other forms of words and other lyrics. To your point, I think of like the importance of looking at lyrics critically. I think like, yeah, like legislation also needs to be looked at that critically, right? And I haven't read a law in its totality, like who has? Because there isn't this, desire or maybe like this impetus to like really exercise our, agentic citizenship rights to critique language and the way that language is being used at that scale. But I think to also connect it to the other project that we have in the show, there's a series of radios that are broadcasting stories that were developed by students at San Diego State and Acá de San Marcos, that are taking a look at the border through through the lens of science fiction. And in part, that's inspired because of the fact that around 2017, you have this new immigration enforcement memo that really kind of seems to rejoice in bringing back the language of the alien to refer to migrants, to refer to people that are non-citizens. And I think for our students, like that opened up this understanding of the fact that the government was legislating in the language of science fiction, right? Not in the language of concrete facts and reality, but in the language of this imagined sense of how things should be. And I think that that also is an interesting dilemma, right? Like to the point about narcocorridos and movimiento alterado, that it's being written by folks in LA that don't have a connection to the kind of on-the-ground realities and impacts that that music is potentially having on communities in Mexico, and where you have like a serious, you know, and daily confrontation with that violence. And I don't necessarily know, you know, what to do about that, but I think it's interesting to think about these disjunctures that exist between language and the kind of material effect that that language can have. And I think that we live that also as part of just the dynamics at the border. And so, yeah, I think it's an important and interesting question to reflect upon.
Last thing.
It was such a good question.
Because right after, like the newest thing is corridos tumbados, which is a younger generation. So I guess narco corridos is super old, corrido alterado, people in their 30s, maybe 40s, y corridos tumbados, younger generation, 20-year-olds, just having fun, getting super drugged, but not shooting anyone or anything, which is how I guess culture levels itself through generationally. So I recommend corridos tumbados. They're fun. They're not as evil. And good question, by the way.
I also just wanted to plug and invite you to read Sayak Valencia's Core Capitalism, if you haven't. Sayak Valencia's Core Capitalism. I think it's a really powerful text in linking the kind of, linking the type of violence that we see linked to drugs to a larger structural systemic violence that is happening within nation states in terms of the disposability of bodies. And I think thinking about the border, you also see that in terms of Operation Gatekeeper, the fact that bodies are being legislated as these things that are disposable, right? In the same way that in those songs, you have the gratuitousness of violence. And so I invite that. And I think the other shout out that I just wanted to give is to Norma Iglesias Prieto, who I think that like the quote about the borderization of the country comes from there. And also I think to Pepe's point about Tijuana as this kind of like portal. She also, during that conversation, mentioned that Tijuana es como una lupa que amplifica todo, which has always stuck with me, that it's like Tijuana, and I think the context for the border is always like a magnifying glass to really examine so many of these dynamics that have these larger repercussions, but again, from a very kind of cited and localized place of analysis.
So let your mom know that we gave you, we gave you a crash course. We took good care of you. Okay. Yeah, good question. I know we're like toward the end. It's 6 o'clock exactly, but I'd like to leave room for at least one other question for people to be able to continue the conversation if you'd like. Yes. Yeah, we could pass the mic or you can go over there. Whatever's easiest.
So there's a lot in this conversation, and I thank you for it, because I went to see the show and it's been a while. And so just as the art can speak for itself, but it can't always, but this conversation has really rounded it out beautifully. And I think one without the other wouldn't be as perfect as this conversation is. But I also wanted to acknowledge you all as being, like, I'm white. I'm white wherever I go. I'm white in Minneapolis. I'm especially white since George Floyd. I'm white here in San Diego. And I experienced the border as more of a barrier than any of you guys have talked about. And so I admire and respect the multicultural places that you come from. And I just feel like it's, you experience it more as it's a border, but it's a permeable border. But I also recognize the level of verve that it takes to go between. Just when I travel, just to have your wits about you, to have all your acknowledgments, endorsements, identification on you. And I just thought maybe it'd be an interesting thing to hear about borders, permeable borders, barriers, and what how you experience them, but then just also acknowledge you for moving between all the time.
Let's start maybe with our virtual panelists, if you would like to respond. So the permeability of borders is the question. how permeable do we experience them? Or do
I think
the
you all
artists
do
here
experience
experience
them as a permeable thing, because I recognize these as boundaries and barriers. And I've heard from everything you've said today how you go between, and I think we need that level just to live today. The world is moving fast, and it's one rule and then it's another rule, and how do you be a rule follower but a rule breaker if you just don't, there's just a lot. So I guess I wanted to hear about it from your perspective of moving in between, and I feel like I have a better idea of what the third space is today more than ever. So thank you also for that. Yeah, it's something about that.
Yeah. Anybody like to speak to permeability? Adriana?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the word. It's gonna be 2 a.m. here in my reality. So, so many things. Those connections, and I mean, ability and to.
Te estás cortando, Adriana.
Sorry, can you hear it?
Yeah, but it just kind of comes in and out a little bit, just to let you know.
Okay, now it's more.
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, I will try to reach. I mean, now okay.
Yeah.
Okay, permeability and borders. I was thinking about also your question about TLC, and could you ask about and postpone of this and connect it to all the binational situation, violence and everything. And we forget one very important element, the emotional, sensorial component of the border that actually permit the merchandises and smuggling of things. There are this border that connect and don't permit to cross and experiment. My audio is cutting.
Yeah, your audio is cutting, but what I'm hearing you say is that it's a selective permeability, right? And it's very dictated by the market, again, the free market. So it's like there is a free flow of goods and services, and there has been this post 9/11 militarization of the border and shifting of the immigration bodies, for example, the regulation bodies from the naturalization service to Department of Homeland Security with the Immigration Customs and Enforcement, ICE, right? So through that shift and that greater kind of militarization and that tighter control, ironically, the border became more and more open for the flow of goods and income producing.
Yeah,
labor isn't going anywhere in the United States.
In a way,
Right?
the pandemic, like limits on mobility that we experienced this before. Like it's like the border itself, like this space, like exceptional space to test things that will happen in the future, in a way. So definitely, like with the pandemic, the no mobility is the only legal people who is U.S. citizen, and for the first time in my generation, people was not able to cross, and that was they feel like limited in their life. In the permeability, extended border life was like impossible to cross. This show was postponed also, and thinking on those events like what is all of the emotions and senses on this? How people, because all these rules about gender and the impossibility to be families together, families in both sides of the border, and people who can the actual permit and to be together. In the case of this, for example, I was thinking so much about the distance and the virtuality and how we are able to experiment I'm so sorry, my audio is so distorted, right? It's not possible to continue.
A little bit, but it came across what you were saying, that
Yeah.
after the pandemic, during the pandemic, right, that there were many who could never cross the border legally, right? Legally, like with documents, long before there was ever a pandemic, and so crossing was never sort of a possibility for them. Even crossing without papers, right, and becoming an undocumented person through this process of deciding to embark upon this crossing. All of a sudden, now you're called undocumented as a person, right? That's interesting. Think about like how the language also. So maybe the takeaway from what Adriana is saying here is that the permeability or impermeability of the border doesn't necessarily follow the same logic for everyone, right? So, or the same rules. Not everyone has to play by the same rules. I would argue that we don't live on a border in San Diego, really. Like we don't live a border in San Diego. There's a huge buffer zone that we call a state park, right? That is kind of like so that we don't ever have to perceive the other side or be disturbed by it, right? And so that's like where, yeah, of course, precarity or not, like the like lack of being able to cross, of course, is going to make you wonder or look more, pay attention to what's going on the other side. And in a really fascinating event that we did, the last presentation that we did, which was of a children's animation project where a group of children from Tijuana and a group of children from San Diego were trained by the same group of the same French animators to make an animation about the other side of the border. And the children from Tijuana knew so much more in detail about the landscape of San Diego, even though they had far less access, to cross. And the kids from San Diego have full access to be able to cross whenever they want, right? Of course, everyone has to stand in the line coming back, and it can be inconvenient if you don't have a sentry, if you don't. But they depicted Tijuana in their animation as gray washes of just like shanties, like it was just really abstract, and it wasn't, and there was like dumps and washes of like, informal settlements or slums, right? So thinking about that, the access to knowledge doesn't necessarily make one seek it, right? It's like,
Right. It's like perception is your reality.
yeah. And so maybe that's kind of a roundabout, some answers.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
I have a short story. The first
Yeah.
time I went to Tijuana, it was shortly after I moved here in 2013. So it was right in the middle of the construction of the new entry, and everything was sort of torn up. And the most terrifying moment was when I crossed and there was no checkpoint. And I'd never crossed a border where you just went through a doorway. And I was sure that I had screwed something up, that I had gone through the wrong door and accidentally crossed the border. When I talked to Pepe afterward, he said, yeah, that's the most civilized border crossing in the world, one way. And that open door where you could cross and then that closed wall going back was, I think it was both illuminating in the very simple, stark metaphor that it gives us of the non-reciprocal quality, but it was also temporary. And Misael talking about the logic of the law coming from afar, that was a moment when the human logic had to triumph, just out of contingency because someone had broken the wall. And it just so happened that it was the governments who had broken the wall. But when that wall broke, the human logic took over, and it was just people need to cross. So I'll always remember that, the most civilized border crossing in the world, one way.
Thank you for sharing that. I want to share a very personal story as well. Short one. and I know we're going a little, we're going over. It's 6:12, but we'll try to wrap this up in the next 3-5 minutes here, because I know everybody's tired and maybe you want to go look at the exhibition. If you got in before 4:30, you got the game parking rates, and you're locked into that. So there might be like a few dollars if you go over 2 hours on your validation and your ticket, but you're not going to be charged special event rates. So don't be worried about that. My son's father was undocumented, and my son was born in San Diego, and his father had crossed back over to go and live in Mexico just before I knew that I was pregnant. And so then later when I had my son, and I went to Tijuana and met my son's father there so that he could meet his dad. After he was born, my son was 4 days old, and I crossed him across the border so that he could go. We met, at a motel in Tijuana, and he came up from Cabo, where he lives, and so he could meet his son. And it was Thanksgiving weekend, and he said, just, take me with you. Let's just go, let's go. Maybe there'll be nobody at the border, and we can just cross and we can get in, and then I'll just be over there with you, And here I was with a newborn baby. I wasn't going to risk that, because, not only would he be taken into custody, but I would, right, for smuggling. And I wanted to so badly, and I was so angry that I was the one who was put in the position to make that decision, because I had to say, no, I'm not going to take you back over with me. And when I got to the border, this was the only time actually that this ever happened for me, but there was nobody there. They were just all open. There was nobody checking. It was, I don't know, around Thanksgiving time, like a few days before. And there was nobody. And I crossed through. This never happened before, but I just drove right through. So strange. And I was like, oh, I could have brought him and it would have been fine, I mean, for many reasons, it's a good thing I didn't, but right, it's just really that was the eeriest, because I never thought that could ever happen. There always had, any port that doesn't have someone standing at the kiosk is closed and you can't go through. So talking about permeability, it's also this kind of gamble, right? Yeah, so yeah, we're all very personally also invested. Anybody else have a question?
Is that the border is always cited by people that are proponents of it as a solution, but the border is always the admission of failure of communication, a failure of logic, a failure of acknowledgeability of the migration of people, which is inherent. So a border is never a solution, and it's always marketed as a solution. And whether it be the Berlin Wall or whatever, it's not a solution. And I think that's the image of a wall that's being sold is totally erroneous. That's all I'd say. Good night.
Thank you, Louis. Thank you for being with us. That was rad. Mic drop. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. I hope you get a chance. Please, if you haven't seen the exhibition, do go and look at it. And stay tuned for more programming through the end of our show, which closes on the 8th. Which closes on the 7th, so sorry. And Saturday the 7th, we'll be having a closing event. So stay tuned for details about that as well. Thank you so much for being with us today and for all your questions. Thank you. Thank you to the artists. Thank you so much for being here in person and virtually as well. Another hand for our artists.